It's nice to be back. I hope you've had a lovely couple of weeks and had a chance to absorb and process what we learned about a couple of weeks ago. Quick review of what we are focused on in this particular CEU event. I want to make sure everyone leaves here feeling like they have a better, deeper, stronger understanding of the nature of OCD and the nature of GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, and that you feel more confident in terms of what are those hallmark features that I should be looking for. I want you to be able to screen more effectively, more efficiently, and differentiate between these two, and then know what to do next. So, last week when I was here, not last week, 2 weeks ago, time is meaningless now. When I was here, we talked through kind of the core of what keeps both of these diagnoses alive. What is fueling the cycle and really maintaining the suffering for these particular clients? And we talked about this as an anxiety alarm, specifically a false alarm. When our anxiety alarm goes off when it doesn't need to, screaming danger, a grizzly bear amount of danger, when it is in fact just a teddy bear. This is at the core of both OCD and at the core of GAD. So we're going to keep this in mind today. And last time, we spent most of our time looking specifically at OCD. We looked at the cycle that maintains OCD that we're really trying to target with treatment interventions. And here in this diagram, I'll just remind us in yellow, highlighted in yellow, we have that false alarm. There's a trigger, there's a perceived threat. When your alarm, your anxiety alarm goes off screaming danger, and when that alarm goes off, sympathetic nervous system clicks on, dumping chemicals into our body that create the anxiety and distress that can really push us around. And when we feel that anxiety or distress, we naturally feel an urge to do something to try to neutralize the perceived threat. And this is what we call compulsions. And then we learned last time that every single time we engage in a neutralizing behavior or a compulsion, we learn that threat must be indeed dangerous. We confirm the threat and continue to tighten this alarm. And a really tight alarm is much more likely to go off as a false alarm, lying to us. A nice loose alarm is still going to go off for a grizzly bear, but it's way less likely to go off as a false alarm. This is at the heart and soul of what we're looking for. So when you're screening for OCD, for generalized anxiety disorder, this is what you're really looking for first, right? It's really easy to get so lost in the details of someone's story, to get lost in the weeds. It's important to be able to zoom out and recognize when this alarm is at the heart of what your client is experiencing. So look for this first and then pull apart the details. When it's OCD, one of those details that we add to our false alarm is intrusive thoughts, also known as obsessions, right? Those thoughts that come in uninvited, unwanted, disturbing, and sticky. They hold extra meaning for someone experiencing OCD. And they're very much counter to who this person is and the values that they hold. This is that picture of OCD. Now, today, we are going to zoom in on what this cycle can look like in GAD and really start to pull apart generalized anxiety disorder. You may or may not remember from last time, I'm the Director of Research and Outcomes at OCD Anxiety Centers. We have 3 IOP and PHP clinics up and down the Salt Lake Valley. And I've been there for a really long time. And we've always specialized in OCD. It's literally in our name. It is our thing. And I still remember the day we added generalized anxiety disorder to the list of things we treat. We had someone come in, they were desperate for help, and we didn't have a protocol yet. And so we really saw this need and dove in, trying to pull this disorder apart, recognizing that it was truly its own beast. I think that's something that's really important to recognize. Generalized anxiety disorder is not a throwaway diagnosis. It's not a not otherwise specified option. It's not just someone with lots of anxiety. I'm not sure what other diagnosis to give them. Generalized anxiety disorder is its own beast. And it's really important to recognize that and to separate. I'm going to really encourage and challenge all of you. I can't tell you how often someone comes into my office and tells me they've been diagnosed with anxiety. And I take a deep breath and I tell them, you can't be diagnosed with anxiety. Anxiety is not a diagnosis. Anxiety is a human emotion. Remember, anxiety is not the enemy. Anxiety is not pathological. Our anxiety alarm is our friend. It keeps us safe from the grizzly bears. It's when our anxiety starts going off as a false alarm that we have a problem. And so please separate the language. Stop telling people they have anxiety if they have generalized anxiety disorder. Recognize this for what it truly is and use all the words. It really, really does matter. So we're going to dive in and we are going to pull apart generalized anxiety disorder as it really is. Hallmark features. I said last time, I love the DSM. It's really hard to memorize the entire DSM and to use it actively, all the diagnostic criteria for all the clients that come into your office. In real life, we have limited time. We just have to be more efficient. So hallmark features to look for when identifying, is this a client suffering from GAD? Worry. Worry is our hallmark feature. It is not a lot of anxiety. Gosh, that could be anything. Differential diagnosis wise, that ain't going to help you. But worry as the key hallmark feature is going to help you, and it's going to start separating this person from the pack and help you recognize it as GAD. But everybody worries, right? Who here is a mom? We worry. People worry, and it's kind of a natural part of life, even though it is, of course, useless. But worry isn't an experience that necessarily sets people apart as pathological. However, if you have someone who is worrying instead of living their life, that is going to become clear pretty quickly when evaluating. That is the first key you're really looking for. Someone that worries instead of living their life. They're worrying so much it's taken over. And oftentimes, GAD clients will actually identify worry as their go-to coping strategy. These are some of the things I really like to ask clients when I'm screening. I always ask, what are you most afraid of? Cuts through a lot of the noise, gets right to it. What are you most afraid of? And what is your go-to coping strategy? And oftentimes, someone with GAD, their go-to coping strategy will be to worry. And we'll break down a little bit more of why that is and how that develops. But it's a very helpful thing to look for when you're doing an initial evaluation. Worry. Worrying instead of living your life, and worry as the go-to coping strategy. Make sense so far? Thank you for the encouraging nods. I can only see some of your faces, and I'm relying very heavily on you. Okay. Now, remember I said it was years ago that, oh, look at all the emojis. Those are so encouraging. Thank you. What a lovely audience. Earlier, I mentioned that there is a false alarm at the heart of both OCD and generalized anxiety disorder. However, I also mentioned when we first had a GAD client come through that we had to figure out how to help. We dove into the literature like we always do at OCD anxiety centers. We were very thorough. We started putting together a protocol, a conceptualization for this disorder. I tried tirelessly to make the diagram a circle. I promise you, I tried so hard to make it a pretty circle, just like the false alarm diagram, just like the OCD diagram. They're so clear and helpful. There is a false alarm at the core of GAD, and I promise I'll show it to you later as a circle. But to understand the complexity of GAD as a whole, I'm so sorry, I could not make it a circle. Crumpled up pieces of paper all over my kitchen floor trying to do this. It's not a circle. So it's actually, oh, it came across really weird today. Okay. It is actually a compass. And I know that is less satisfying than a circle, but trust me, it's going to be really helpful. I think about GAD as a compass. And in each direction, we have worry. But to understand, it's a circle of circles. Oh, that's nice. Thank you, Kenwin. That's a good spin. To really understand how GAD works, it's really helpful to break down the various functions that worry serves in someone's life. And the reason that this can't be a circle and it really has to be the compass is because each client might present a little differently. Not all clients present the exact same way with all 4 functions. And it's very important to slow down and take the time to map out this GAD compass as part of your case conceptualization. Because each direction of worry, each function of worry is going to indicate what kinds of interventions are going to set this client up for success. So we'll break it down one at a time. And hopefully worry comes across as one whole word because that looks a little funny. Oh, good. So let's start to the east on our compass. To the east, we look at the function of worry that is worry instead of experiencing emotion. Y'all, this one was honestly one of the most interesting things as I really dove into the literature on GAD. Worry instead of experiencing emotion. Let me be as clear as I can. This does not mean someone is worrying to try intentionally to avoid feeling emotion. This does not mean someone is worrying and they're numbing out or dissociating. This is something that's happening in the background. Worry instead of experiencing emotion captures the idea that worry is a very language-based process in the brain, right? We worry with words, while emotion is not so naturally a language-based process in the brain. And so what's happening is these almost function like a funny little teeter-totter. When one is clicked on, the other one dims and it teeter-totters. It's not off completely, but it's dimmed. So when someone is worrying, and someone with GAD worries an awful lot, when someone is worrying, their capacity to naturally experience and digest the emotions coming in, it dims. And so what happens for someone that is spending so much time worrying, clicking on that language-based process in the brain, they're not naturally digesting the emotions that come in. Instead, Emotions are still coming in. Remember, they're not numbed out, they're not dissociated. Those emotions are coming in, but they're piling up. They're piling up at the top. They're not naturally digesting as our emotions typically do. Think about this. This is why someone with GAD presents in your office as so very twitchy. You can tell who has GAD almost by the way they physically present in the room. They are moving, they are twitchy, they're on edge. They often sit on the edge of the couch or the chair. It looks like they're about to bolt for the door. Sometimes they don't sit down at all. Sometimes they're the one pacing in a little circle throughout your office during the session. These are all potential signs of GAD, and what's happening is this function of worry instead of digesting the emotion. Simply because in the background, these are very counter processes in the brain. Make sense so far? Those nice, encouraging little emojis again. Oh, I love them so much. So reinforcing. Okay. You can also always put like a little thumbs down emoji if you're like, I have no idea what the crazy lady is saying. And I'll pause for a moment. We're going to really lean on those emojis. I love them. Okay.
Hey,
So,
Kate, before we go further, someone did have a question. Lori's asking if GAD could resemble ADHD.
yeah, that is definitely something that you'd want to screen for and differentiate between. Absolutely, the difficulty concentrating, the that physical presentation. Absolutely, it's very smart to take a look at those things as well. And a lot of things can honestly masquerade as GAD, not only OCD. ADHD can masquerade as GAD. Post-concussive syndrome can also masquerade very easily as GAD. Make sure that you're always in your screening asking those medical rule out questions, asking about a history of traumatic brain injury, concussion. Post-concussive syndrome can look an awful lot like GAD, actually. Great question. Are there other questions so far, Joseph?
We just had one earlier. It looks like someone had asked, is there a difference between intrusive and obsessive thoughts in terms of duration? For example, obsessive thoughts stay longer and intrusive thoughts can come and go. This person said, I get confused between these two.
Which is really fair because language is a funny, funny thing. And the language we use in this field is often very different from the language that normal everyday people use in the world. So, when it comes to OCD, there is absolutely no difference whatsoever between intrusive thoughts and obsessive thoughts, right? They are, in fact, synonyms. Obsessions equals intrusive thoughts. Um, Now, out in the real world, obsessive means something different. It means something intentional, right? Fixation. But that is never what we're talking about when we're talking about OCD. Obsessions in terms of OCD is always intrusive thoughts, unwanted, uninvited thoughts that come in and can launch that alarm. Good question. So, are we ready to take a peek to the south? I like the reveals that come with the compass. It's just more fun. To the south. To the south, we see a really common and important function of GAD that can often very easily come up, but in a tricky way in a screening. What we see here is worry instead of problem solving. Now, it's important to recognize that in many, many clients, not all clients, but in many, many clients that have GAD, they have a tendency to worry thinking they are problem solving. If you ask a GAD client, how are your problem solving skills? And they tell you, oh my gosh, I'm the best problem solver. I'm problem solving all day long. Red flag. Ask more questions. Someone that's problem solving all day long is really likely actually worrying. And they're worrying, thinking that it is the same as problem solving. But these are distinctly different. Worry is useless. Worry is churning the same problem over and over again in your brain, but you never get to a resolution. I once had a client describe worry as a rocking chair. She says, you put in an awful lot of effort, but you never go anywhere. And I have loved that since she said it to me because it's so true. Worry never gets to a solution. Worry never gets to the action taken on that solution. Worry just starts over. Problem solving always gets to a solution with action attached to that solution. These are such different processes, and yet clients with GAD often worry instead of problem solving, thinking they are problem solving. But because worry does not work, it's the rocking chair that goes nowhere. What they can learn is that problem solving must not work, at least not for them. This is referred to as a negative problem orientation. This is a term that means the belief that problem solving doesn't work, at least not for me. And it develops in our GAD clients when they have that tendency to worry instead of problem solve, thinking they're problem solving. And you can imagine how quickly this is going to take someone down. If you believe that problem solving doesn't work, the world very quickly becomes a scary, dangerous, and very overwhelming place. My shoe's untied, I'm doomed. Every little problem becomes so overwhelming. This causes a great deal of distress for our GAD clients. So ask them about problem solving and pull it apart a little bit more. Ask them when they problem solve, how often do they get to a solution? How often do they take action on that solution to start pulling apart problem solving versus worry? Questions on this one? Yes, everybody gets a copy of the PowerPoint slides. I feel like Oprah. You get one. You get one. Oprah does it better. Are we ready to go to the north? Okay. Thank you, Savannah, for encouraging emoji. Oh, quick question in the chat. Can someone have both GAD and OCD? Yeah, they super can. Absolutely. And we're going to talk about some of the differentials to look for. But first, let's take a look to the north. And this one is especially important. Worry as a neutralizing behavior. Let's take a moment to remember 2 weeks ago, that feels so long ago now, where we defined clearly what we mean by neutralizing behavior. Remember, this was synonymous to compulsions when we talked about OCD. And a neutralizing behavior is any behavior that tries to neutralize a perceived threat. It is not any behavior that makes you feel better. I promise you, most of the time it makes you feel worse right away. It's not anything you do when you're anxious. It is any behavior that tries to neutralize a perceived threat. It's what you do when faced with a grizzly bear that's going to eat your face. Neutralizing behavior. Now, when I say worry as a neutralizing behavior, remember that one of those hallmark features to look for with GAD is that this is someone that says worry is their go-to coping strategy. So let's break down why. Why is worry functioning as a neutralizing behavior in our GAD clients? For many clients with GAD, it's really interesting they hold this nasty core belief, this core belief that worry has utility. Meaning, if I don't worry, something bad will happen. Or sometimes, if I don't worry about them, it means I don't really love them, right? Worry has utility for these clients. It is functioning as a neutralizing behavior, trying to neutralize perceived threat through this belief. If I don't worry, something bad will happen. Make sense so far? I'm about to pour gasoline on this fire. Okay, got my can of gasoline. Pouring gasoline onto the fire is to the west. Worry about worry. Oh, shoot. Gasoline on the fire. Worry about worry. This is the idea that captures, think diagnostically, someone with GAD, their go-to coping strategy is to worry. They often believe worry has utility. If I don't worry, something bad will happen. However, these are clients that typically have realized that they've lost control of that worry, right? If I start to worry, I lose control of it. And I get sucked into what I like to call the worry vortex. And if you have sat in a room with someone with GAD, you have felt the worry vortex because it pulls you in as well as the clinician. That worry vortex is so strong. And when GAD clients start to worry, they often lose control and get sucked in. And that is scary. And they're often afraid they are going to get sucked into this worry vortex for all time. They get really escalated, they get really worked up, really overwhelmed, exhausted. That worry vortex. But remember, what is their go to coping strategy again? Right, to worry. And so, what happens, the gasoline on the fire, is now we develop a tendency to worry about worry. I'm now worried that I will start worrying, lose control, and get sucked into the worry vortex. Y'all, this cycle has never spun faster than when it's GAD because of this bubble to the west. Worry about worry. And what often happens, and this is where we can see our highest severity clients, the clients who are truly housebound. What happens is we start to avoid anything that might trigger worry. I can't let myself start worrying. And if I have to avoid everything that might trigger worry, that's a lot of stuff. And someone's world can get really, really small, really, really fast, desperately trying to avoid getting sucked into the worry vortex for all time. Makes sense so far? Questions so far? Okay. So,
I have a question.
if somebody has a question, where'd they go?
It's right here. Sorry, my camera's off. But,
I see you. Go ahead.
um, so with that being the case, like worrying about worry, my brain goes to if we isolate a worry, right? And so I was thinking about agoraphobia, right? And so I'm isolating the worry of going outside, interacting with people in the world. And so is that a um, is that a hyper worry? And we just call it agoraphobia.
Great question. So the question is, what about when the worry is more hyper focused, right? Like in agoraphobia, worry about this specific thing. Why do we call it agoraphobia? How is that different than GAD? And the answer is actually a really important distinction. And again, it comes down to the silliness of language. The way that we use the word worry is a verb. to worry, right? The way that that question uses the word worry, I would replace with the word fear. I'm afraid of blank versus worry, which is a behavior. Worry, I conceptualize, it's a mental behavior. So the content of the worry doesn't matter quite as much, right? That's what am I afraid of? That's really helpful to screen for. What are you most afraid of? Someone with GAD is most afraid of worry. They're most likely most afraid of uncontrollable worry and getting sucked into that worry vortex for all time. That's what they're afraid of. What they worry about, they might give you a whole separate list of things, and it's going to start getting very, very scrambled. So one of the first things that I teach my clients is to start separating this language. When we're talking about worry in here, it's a verb, to worry, versus the many things you might be afraid of, the many things you might worry about. We're going to separate those two. Great question. If we zoom out here, we can see on the inner layer those 4 functions of worry. Really, really helpful to take the time with clients. If you suspect GAD, pull this out. Like I said, you get a copy of these. This is yours, presents for everybody. Pull this out and map out that client's compass, because each GAD client may look a little bit different. For some GAD clients, all 4 directions will be very clearly lit up. But for other GAD clients, you may only see 2, 3, or 1 of these functions lit up. And it's so important to take the time to conceptualize that clearly and collaboratively with the client. I love them to see this visually on the compass, because that's going to direct 2 things. 1, what consequences do these functions of worry have? And 2, what can we do about it? So on this diagram zoomed out, you see in the middle the 4 functions of GAD, and on the outside, the consequence of each function of GAD. You're starting to see how this suffering is maintained. And then we're going to flip it all into what kinds of interventions are going to be most useful to target each direction. For the east here, worry, instead of experiencing emotions, we're not digesting those emotions, and we're seeing that overflow of emotions. These are people that present as really highly anxious, really keyed up, restless, twitchy, pacing. To the south, we see that worry, instead of problem solving, leading us to that negative problem orientation, the belief that problem solving doesn't work, at least not for me. And to the north, we've got worry as a neutralizing behavior, which continues to reinforce the idea, that core belief that worry has utility. If I don't worry, something bad will happen. And then to the west, worry about worry. I lose control, get sucked into the worry vortex. My go-to coping strategy is to worry. And so as a result, I start to avoid anything that might trigger worry, because now worry itself is seen as a threat, sounding the alarm. Still with me? Hey, I always keep my promises. I promised I'd show it to you in the pretty circle, just like I showed OCD with that false alarm. Here we have our false alarm. This is our basic false alarm that we started with 2 weeks ago. We've got the trigger. We've got the perceived threat, anxiety, distress, urge to neutralize, neutralizing behavior, confirmation of threat. In GAD, this can look a couple of different ways. First, the trigger, the world is your oyster. The trigger can be any stressor at all that might trigger worry. This is why this is seen so broad. The perceived threat becomes much narrower, though. Right? In OCD, the perceived threat is, woo, truly limitless. But with GAD, what are you most afraid of, right? What is the real threat your brain is capturing? A perceived threat is worry. I will worry and not be able to stop, getting sucked into the worry vortex for all time. That's the fear, the threat that is sounding the alarm. And when our alarm goes off, we tend to do a neutralizing behavior. And what is their go-to neutralizing behavior? Worry. And we confirm worry is dangerous, and anything that might trigger worry is dangerous. That is what we'll learn, tightening that alarm further. Worry is taking up a lot of bubbles here. This has never spun faster than when it's GAD. GAD is truly its own beast, and it really deserves to be recognized as such and approached in a really thoughtful way. Now, the other reason I couldn't just put this in a circle is because sometimes it looks a little bit different in the circle. Sometimes it can look like this. The only thing that changes between these two is that perceived threat. Here, the perceived threat is still worry, but it's this, if I don't worry, something bad will happen. If I don't worry, something bad will happen. Well, what do I need to do? Worry. And worry super never works. It's the rocking chair. You go nowhere. But it sure will teach you every single time the threat is real. All of these potential stressors sure are dangerous. Imagine how tight that alarm must be in your GAD clients. They are so on edge. And gosh, it makes sense when you really pull it all apart. Actually, before I dive into that, because that gets all sticky. Questions so far? Let it simmer for a second.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Kara.
And maybe you already said this and I missed it, or we're going to get to it, but with differentiating OCD, mental compulsions, and worry, like how do you tease those two out? Because I feel like the worry is like a mental compulsion for a lot of people with OCD.
Goodness, yes. So with that, now let's look at that was just a thank you for the silver platter there, Kara. I swear I did not hire Kara or put her up to that, but the timing was excellent. Because Kara is so right. It can be very, very tricky. So let's take a moment and pit these against each other side by side. I'm going to open this with, this will never be perfect. Do your best. Do your best, and sometimes you have to take a best guess. And for those of us that use insurance, sometimes you have to write down your best guess and submit it to the insurance company and be willing to change it later. So please remember that good differential diagnosis is not a sentence. It is meant to be a fluid process that continues with continued assessment throughout the treatment process. Give yourself some grace, do your best, and be willing to change it. That is how differential diagnosis is meant to be. So with that shell of imperfection that we will all lean into, here are some things that can help differentiate between OCD and GAD when they can look awfully similar. And to someone's point earlier, can certainly happen together at the same time. So let's start with differentiating, and then we'll talk a little bit about what happens when they're both actually there and how can we tell. So the first item will pit them against each other. With GAD, the content of the worry right? What are they afraid of? The content of the worry is often the same as what the average person worries about. It's normal stuff. I'm worried about relationships, I'm worried about health, I'm worried about finances, I'm worried about tomorrow, I'm worried about yesterday. The same sorts of things we all worry about. The content of the worry, it's not the weird stuff. It's the same stuff everyone worries about. However, the frequency, the intensity of that worry is excessive when it's GAD, right? It's not just how everyone worries. This is someone worrying differently. They're worrying too much. They're worrying instead of living their lives. With OCD, what they're most afraid of, that the content of the fear often, but not always, goes beyond what the average person worries about. If they're worried about the weirder stuff, right? If someone is afraid that they're going to get AIDS by touching a doorknob, that ain't GAD. Cross it off your list. And where it gets super imperfect is that someone with OCD might be afraid of something super normal to worry about, like relationships, like finances. So there's an awful lot of overlap there, but this is the first layer that can be very, very helpful. If it's a worry the average person doesn't have, cross GAD off the list and start looking at OCD. But that's definitely not enough because of all the overlap, so let's add some layers to help us keep pulling it apart. The next one, under GAD, neutralizing behaviors. Remember, behaviors that try to neutralize a perceived threat. Those neutralizing behaviors in GAD are often covert, meaning worry is that go-to neutralizing behavior. Worry is a mental neutralizing behavior. It's something that can be very, very invisible. And avoidance is the other most common neutralizing behavior that we see in GAD. These are very covert neutralizers. These clients can very easily be the silent sufferers. Nobody knows how much they're really suffering. In OCD, neutralizing behaviors may be overt, meaning they're really obvious and observable compulsions. They may also be covert, those silent mental compulsions. So if we've got really overt, obvious, observable compulsions, start taking a peek at OCD. If all you're seeing are these covert mental neutralizers, I recommend keeping both on the table, OCD and GAD. Then looking at this next layer. Now, I often get the question about uncertainty, right? OCD has been referred to in the field as the doubting disease because OCD often, but not always, demands certainty. It demands this special magical certainty that doesn't even exist. OCD often, but not always, really struggles to tolerate uncertainty. Oftentimes, the sorts of things I'm looking for when I pull apart mental neutralizing behaviors, those mental compulsions, I often ask the client, what are you trying to accomplish when you do that in your head? What are you trying to accomplish? And I'm looking for certainty. I need the certainty. OCD demands the certainty. Oftentimes, this sounds like I'm trying to figure it out. And this can be really similar to what's happening in worry. So this is one that often looks similar, but gets a little bit more concrete in the certainty and the trying to figure it out in OCD, whereas in GAD, it often sounds a little bit more like problem solving that doesn't get to a solution. But these can overlap and tangle very, very much. Now, I mentioned earlier, this is a fluid process, this differential diagnosis piece, and y'all are human and you're going to do your best. Give yourself some grace. And one of the things that can honestly be super helpful is to do a little experimenting. With GAD, challenging thinking errors, right? That nice cognitive restructuring intervention can be very effective. It's not typically sufficient. If that's all you're doing with your GAD clients, you're not going to get to the finish line, but it can be effective. Versus with OCD, if you try challenging thinking errors, it's going to blow up in your face pretty quickly. You're going to have that same conversation over and over and over again. And by the third time challenging the same thinking error that is in fact an intrusive thought, take a step back and recognize that you've already been here. That is often really helpful way to distinguish between GAD and OCD. With OCD, it's going to function as reassurance. It's not going to stick. It's going to be like Teflon or sand in your hand slipping through your fingers. But with GAD, it will stick. Challenging thinking errors will be more successful. And sometimes that's how you figure out which one you're dealing with, to be perfectly honest. The last one here can be really helpful and again can have some overlap. With GAD, symptoms are associated with a variety of worry topics across domains, those supernormal worries, but across several domains, which is why we call it generalized anxiety disorder. There isn't a focus on a single thing that they're worried about. Those domains are often things like health, safety, finances, achievement, the same sorts of things we all worry about. In OCD, the symptoms may only be associated with a single topic. So if the OCD at any given point of time has a singular focus, lean more towards OCD than GAD, because GAD is more spread broadly. However, it is very important to recognize with OCD, the thing someone's worried about, the thing someone is afraid of tends to shift and change. OCD is just a hungry monster looking for low-hanging fruit. As someone's life evolves, as their values change, the fear will change with it. OCD is hungry, and it looks for low-hanging fruit. These can often look really similar, and someone with OCD may have many fears at the same time. Remember, each of them is going to be a little bit more laser focused, whereas GAD is more spread. Questions so far?
It looks like we did have a few questions in the chat. You may have actually addressed some of these, but we'll go over them just to make sure that everyone's got a response. I know, let's see, Chris had asked, when does GAD and OCD become hypervigilance or a trauma response?
Ooh, that is a loaded question. I'm going to answer it as simply as I can because I feel like I could probably do like a whole another 2 hours on that. Two things to keep in mind. If something is best accounted for, if symptoms, active symptoms are best accounted for by trauma response, you need to be looking at PTSD. And we should also always look through a trauma-informed lens, which means recognizing that humans often have a history of trauma and distinguishing between how that may be interacting with a GAD diagnosis or an OCD diagnosis, distinguishing that versus someone whose symptoms are all best accounted for by a PTSD diagnosis. Means there's a trauma history and active trauma symptoms. My personal favorite tool for supporting that distinction is the PCL-5, which is a publicly available measure. I think it's technically called the PTSD checklist for the DSM-5. PCL-5, Google it. It's super helpful to break down those concrete trauma symptoms. And we will use that often in our clinics to help distinguish between what is really PTSD masquerading as these other things and what are these other things through a trauma-informed lens. So that's my short form answer.
Great. And then Clint had asked for a person with both OCD and GAD, how does a clinician decide what to address first? Intrusive
Ooh,
thoughts, compulsions, worries, intolerance of uncertainty.
great question. We can absolutely see comorbid OCD and GAD. What to address first is certainly a case by case question. I wouldn't say there's any blanket statement there. I will often encourage our clinicians to look at number one, what is causing them the most impact in their day to day life, and look at the specific interventions we're going to use for GAD versus OCD, and is starting with one or the other going to set the other up for success, right? One of the things we always do in our clinics is we start by looking at how can we set our clients up for success. So if you've got someone with OCD and GAD and their go-to coping strategy is to worry, and we decide to focus only on the OCD first, they're going to end up in that worry vortex. Versus if we address teaching them how to pull themselves out of the worry vortex, then you're really likely to be more successful with the OCD. But it comes down to what is impacting them at the end of the day as well. They have like a little bitty bit of GAD and a lot of OCD. Goodness gracious. Target that OCD first. Do your best to set them up for success. And make sure the client is part of that conversation always. No, we don't have enough time because I also have to jump into a consultation call in 3 minutes, but we don't have quite enough time to go through all the cases. But again, you guys will have a copy of these slides, and I really encourage you, especially those of you that have clinics, group practices, peer consultation groups, please gift to you, use it however you like. I've got several case vignettes here for you that can really help you put these things into practice. Look through these brief case vignettes. We've got several here for you, and start trying to distinguish, is this an OCD case or a GAD case? And I really encourage you, if you land on GAD, take the time to practice mapping out that GAD compass. It is going to be such a helpful tool. And please remember that I know this is 1 hour, 2 hours with both parts. It is a drop in the bucket. Please remember we're here as a resource. If you've got a tricky case, don't hesitate to reach out. OCD Anxiety Centers is here for you. We love to be a resource in the community. On the last page here, we've got some contact information. We're always happy to consult on a tricky case, do additional training when there's an area of need. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to be a resource.
Yes, thank you, Kate. If you guys have any questions about the presentation or doing a tour or anything like that, I put my contact information here below. I'm one of the clinical outreach specialists for OCD, and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions or get you someone for consultation or anything. So thank you so
Thanks,
much, Kate.
Juliana.
As always, you're very entertaining to watch.
You're so sweet, Juliana. Thank you so much for having me. Please reach out with any lingering questions. I'm happy to answer them. And as always, Joseph, thank you so much for having me with Aspen Grove. It's always a pleasure.
Well, thank you for joining us, Kate. We appreciate everything you do. We really do.
Thank you.